Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
It's a brand new year, and welcome to the first episode of 2025. I'm Duncan Barks. I'm the host of this podcast called A Nation of Taxpayers. In the studio with me this week, we have Elliot Keck. Hello, Elliot.
Hello, Duncan.
And also Darwin Friend.
Hello, Duncan.
Right, ton of stuff to talk about. We're going to look at some of the TPA successes over the festive period in terms of media coverage. We'll do that a little bit later on. But first off, I think 2025 is going to be a fascinating year for many, many reasons. Who wants to go first as to why?
I think it's looking pretty bleak as we go into 2025. I mean, we saw towards the back end of last year, growth revised down from 0.1% to 0. And then the latest quarter as well, we actually saw negative growth, minus 0.1%. And so we're only a quarter away from a recession. So it's not looking pretty good going into 2025, and that's before any of those big tax rises that we heard at the budget announced by Rachel Reeves are actually implemented. So we've got the national insurance hike on employers coming, which is going to hit people's wages and companies' profits overall as well. And so I think it's looking pretty bleak so far. What do you think, Elliot?
Yeah, I think as well as growth, I wonder if the inflation tiger will start stalking the country again. There was an article in the Telegraph just in the last couple of days, a feature with a few companies who are saying that their only solution to the national insurance rise is going to be price increases. They don't want to lay off staff. At the same time, they're already operating on pretty thin margins. They do not have significant profits that they can eat into. So they're going to have to increase prices. We've already seen inflation ticking up. I think it ticked up by, 0.3% from 2.3 to 2.6% or around that in the last quarter. That was explicitly attributed by the organisation that does the data, the Office of National Statistics, on the public sector pay increases. Of course, the reason why public sector pay increases are so damaging for inflation is that, while the public sector does provide important services that we rely on, it doesn't really add to the growth potential of the economy. So, while the NHS being in crisis can harm the economy, ultimately, most of these public services, they don't actually add to our overall economic output, which means that if you're throwing more money into the economy via the public sector, you're not adding to the overall productive power of the economy. And that's how you have inflation, because you have more money chasing the same number of resources. Whereas if you're pumping more money into the private sector, then you can have pay rises, boost to growth without that inflation.
But this stuff is obvious. It's plain to see, which begs the question, why has Rachel Reeves, or why does she still continue to go down this route that she outlined in her budget, the various rises come into effect in April of this year? Why is she doing it?
Well, I think because she believes in the same old tax and spend model, which has seen the economy fail in the past and really struggle. I mean, Elliot was talking about inflation there. Obviously, when inflation's high, interest rates then have to be high as well to try and combat inflation. And what Rachel Reeves has done is, even though she knows interest rates are going to be remaining high, especially compared to recent history when we were seeing interest rates as low as 0.25%, it's going to mean that mortgage holders, people wanting to own a house or even buy their first home, are really going to struggle. And what she's decided to do in combination with that, despite the economics which show that they're going to struggle no matter what anyway, is she's removing that temporary stamp duty cut, which was introduced after COVID to try and help people buy and move house. And so that's actually just going to punish people even further, despite the basic economics which show she shouldn't be doing that.
Elliot, would you agree with that? If you do, I mean, essentially this is still all about ideology, isn't it?
Yeah, and I wonder if looking ahead to this year, that's going to be a real millstone around Reeves's neck. They made a huge amount of political hay over the way in which inflation damaged living standards so much over the last couple of years, the extent to which the Conservatives were to blame for that inflation crisis. And let's be clear, they were to blame for certainly a decent chunk of it. Yes, they did not invade Ukraine. But the COVID spending was a Tory policy. The massive spending post the COVID pandemic was a Conservative policy. And then obviously the Liz Truss mini budget that did partially lead to interest rates remaining high and going increasing. And we saw the damage that interest rates and inflation did to the last government. It was interest rates and inflation as much as anything that absolutely shredded their credibility with Middle England, with most of the British public. And I think it's entirely possible that we see inflation ticking up again this year. That's what the forecasts show. And that will mean interest rates come up again. And you look forward to the next year and you think how bad things are for Labour already and just how unpopular they are. You add a percentage point onto inflation, you add half a percentage point onto interest rates, and it'll be really interesting to see how the public respond.
I think the public will respond by not supporting Labour in the way that they currently are, because you look at Labour in the polling at the moment, they're struggling to actually make any gains. I think in 3 months' time, we'll see them well below 20%. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think it's fair because people are struggling right now. I think when they thought they got rid of the last Conservative government, they thought Labour's going to come in and solve the cost of living crisis for us and actually help us and improve our lives. And what we've actually seen is more of the same, or actually even worse, because at least when the Conservatives left office, we had an extremely strong economy in this country. We were one of the strongest in the G7, I believe. And now what we're seeing negative growth and potentially a recession as we go into 2025.
And they're running out of, they've run out of time now, haven't they, in terms of using it's the last 14 years of the Conservative government. Now they have to be accountable for the decisions that they've made, chiefly in the budget and indeed elsewhere. And consequently, they have to be fully accountable for their actions.
Yes, and it's also the extent to which the deteriorating situation is so obviously their responsibility.
Yeah.
When Cameron and Osborne came to power, they were always able to point to the state of the public finances. And there was no doubt that the state of the public finances was a legacy of the Labour government. However, the fact that growth is so significantly down from when Labour came in, the fact that inflation is now ticking up, the fact that business confidence is collapsing, there's nobody that's in any doubt that this is as a result of the tax rises that, as Darwin mentioned, have mostly not come into place. This is mostly businesses preparing for the tax rise. And to some extent, that will mean that when the tax rises come in, they won't be possibly as severe in their impact as people think, because a lot of these impacts have already been seen. But nevertheless, and this is the case always with the economy, businesses do plan in advance. But nevertheless, in April, this is when it will all come in and things will get worse. And Labour are going to have to start looking for ways to try and make the British people feel better off. And the one on stamp duty is such an obvious one, where suddenly a lot of people that you'd think should be core Labour voters or should have been core Labour voters are suddenly going to be facing significant increases in their cost of buying a house.
Indulge me both for a second in a little flight of fantasy, okay? Because there is a line that has been used by various analysts and Labour Party supporters. I'm just going to run it by both of you, which is, don't look at me like that, which is this is short-term pain for long-term gain. Get the nasty stuff out of the way in the first year of government. Things will slowly start to improve, and then on a run up to the next general election, working on the basis is going to be in 4.5 years time, they will be in a far better place. What would you say, Darwin?
I would say the pain's really not worth it for what they're actually going to achieve. I think when we talk about long-term or short-term pain for long-term gain, I think what the Labour government needs to be doing is looking at more fundamental spending cuts, not just putting more and more taxes on hard-working people and businesses. As we've seen throughout history in this country, and I think across the world generally, is when you lump businesses and taxpayers with yet more tax rises, that doesn't create growth. That never has, and it never will. It's not saying that you have no taxes and that's going to maximize growth, but it's saying there's an optimal level. And in this country for far too long now, we've been way overburdened in terms of the amount of tax that is being taken from people. And so I think in this case, it's really not going to work. I think if we look back to perhaps the 1980s, when it was talking about short-term paying for long-term gain, it was talking about reforming the tax system, reforming how we actually spend money and what we spend it on, which is the way to get us out of this crisis.
It doesn't really stack up, does it?
No, and I wonder if you'll see changes in Labour messaging this year where they just stop talking about growth entirely. because they're obviously not going to U-turn on the budget. It looks like we're not even going to see much in the way of changes on the inheritance tax reforms that they made, despite the fact that those are causing them enormous political damage with no economic or revenue raising, positive result that they can yield from that. It's not going to raise them any money, and it's giving them absolutely enormous political pain. And looks like they're going to stick with their changes, which to some extent they almost have to, because if you completely U-turn on a budget, the crisis that causes your credibility over the coming years is absolutely devastating. So in some respects, they have to stick with it. But that is going to mean they're going to have to find a new narrative for the country. This year, they're going to have to find a new way to sell their political project. They sold it initially as, with growth as one of its centerpieces. Clearly, they're not going to get that. In fact, we're heading for a recession. I think, my prediction is that we probably will see a recession, because I think the data from the last quarter is just going to be so devastating. Because correct me if I'm wrong here, Darwin, it will be Q3 of this financial year that we see the next data for.
Yeah, Q3. Yeah, Q3 is a financial year.
So so you're going to be getting all the post-budget stuff, basically.
Yeah, and it's going to include Christmas, where I think we saw on Boxing Day alone, footfall was down about 9%.
Yeah,
Boxing Day sales.
Yeah, so they're going to have to find a new way to spin what they're doing, and I can only imagine that will be we're investing in public services and to hell with growth.
The Christmas period is really interesting. So I've got a mate who is in Sussex. He runs 2 pubs, and he is part of, he's an independent operator, but there's a group of independent operators who often talk to each other. What's it been like over Christmas? All of them are saying footfall into the pubs massively down. People simply weren't out spending the money that they have done over previous years. And I think that will be reflected in the figures as well.
Yeah, and I think what Elliot says is a good point in that they might try and pivot away from growth, but ultimately, as the old message goes, it is all about the economy. And if we do go into a recession and the economy continues to stagnate, people are going to notice that, and they're going to care about that just as much as they care about public services doing well as well. And so I'd be interested perhaps in what your thoughts are, and if people do see that after the budget's measures do come into place, largely from April, and let's say over the next year we see no real change in the growth figures, what are Labour going to do? Do you think there's any chance they might reverse that, or because they're going to have cake in their face effectively?
Yeah, I mean, but the problem that they face is that if growth doesn't improve, and they're not then able to benefit from the increased tax revenues that you get as a result of improved growth, you then face the problem that, okay, you need to keep on funding the public service improvements that ultimately Labour are going to have to rest their whole credibility on, while at the same time you don't have those additional revenues to pay for it, which means that they won't be in a position where they can cut taxes, right? Because they don't have that money needed. And the problem that they end up facing is you end up with sort of the worst of both worlds, where they're not putting the money into public services to see a notable improvement in the short term, and nor are you getting any kind of economic growth. So my prediction is by the time of the next budget, the economic picture is going to be so bleak that they're not really going to have any room to maneuver unless they genuinely make public spending cuts, as Darwin mentioned. But they're just not going to. I just cannot see any Labour government doing anything serious on public spending. Certainly not this Labour government.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, my prediction will be is fuel duty is going to go up inside the next 12 months. I think that is inevitable. I mean, it's an easy, they can go, oh, look, it's been frozen for goodness knows how many years now. Yeah. It's an easy win. Sorry, guys, we're going to have to put it up. And I think that'll be one of the areas normal people in the real world outside of Westminster will really feel it. And that'll be another kick in the guts, particularly for those who voted Labour.
Well, I'm picking up on a lot of buyer's remorse at the moment.
Yeah, and I mean, we published, Darwin published a major report on wealth taxes just over the last couple of months, based on the view that we have that the Labour Party are eventually going to reach for that lever. In the short term, they may be able to get a quick revenue hit.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's more about the signal that it sends, in that it'll be a strong signal for Labour's base, so it'll be very popular in that sense. Lots of Labour supporters want to see a wealth tax because I think it, rightly in their opinion, punishes the wealthiest in our society. But in reality, as we all know, these never work. They never have. And even if they did, say, for example, implement it, and rather than what they do with most taxes where they give it a little bit of time before it sets in, they say, right, immediately after the budget, we're going to implement this and this is going to be enacted. even if they did that, they'll get some very short-term revenue, but the very wealthiest people in the world and in this country are smart enough to make sure their assets are going to be protected in that instance. And if they're not, they're going to move them out as fast as possible so that then they have long-term security.
Looking ahead elsewhere in 2025, anything else that's piquing anyone's interest? I'm interested in a couple of things, maybe just moving away from figures and numbers for a second. I think we have the May elections for local councils, where they're going to be held, which of course gets us into the whole devolution project that Angela Rayner's trying to get up and running. I also think, and we have to be a little bit careful about this, there'll be an imminent by-election because we have a Labour MP who's been charged. This is Mike Amesbury, who has been representing Runcorn and Helsby. We won't go into the detail because it's a live case, but I think that throws up a really interesting opportunity as well, particularly for, I suppose, Reform UK. That's going to be a test for them. And also Kemi Badenoch as well, because there's been a lot of analysis that's been printed and broadcast, particularly in the last week or so, saying, well, she hasn't got off to a great start, etc., etc. It doesn't matter if you're talking about Reform or indeed the Tories or indeed Labour. It'll be an interesting challenge, that by-election.
Yeah, I agree. And listen, we've had Conservative politicians in this recording studio, and we've had Reform politicians in this recording studio, and there's no doubt that there's a lot of talent in both parties and a lot of people doing some very important work. I think Andrew Griffith, particularly notably in the Conservatives, and Rupert Lowe in Reform, who we've had in this studio. But listen, the Conservatives have a fundamental problem which Kemi's trying to adapt her strategy to, which is that the public don't want to hear from the Conservatives at the moment. And I think she's taking the view that for as long as the public really don't want to hear from the Conservatives, hearing from the Conservatives is going to agitate them. And that does mean you leave a bit of a political vacuum for Reform to move into. And that is a danger, and that is a risk. But I do think there's an equal risk of the Conservatives being active at the moment, which is everybody looking at them. And rather than blaming Labour for the problems that the country's facing, and it is Labour that should be blamed because they are making everything worse across the board, the second the Conservatives step back into the ring, back into the arena, the finger pointing is going to be the Conservatives who, are, as I said, I think it's Labour that are ultimately responsible now. They're in government. But there's no doubt that a lot of these problems were left for the Labour Party by last government, and that's the brutal truth.
So do you think that Kemi's strategy of not saying a great deal at the moment is the right strategy? Because she got some flack over the New Year period for her New Year's message, which I think was less than 47 seconds of video, certainly under a minute. And then the flip side of that, she had Nigel Farage at Blenheim Palace giving it large in this kind of like this sort of very ornate room. Is Kemi doing the right thing by not saying a great deal?
In my opinion, yes. And it's very uncomfortable, particularly for a party that for 14 years has been in government. And for 14 years has been used to essentially being the only game in town. And that's the state that you're in when you're the government, and particularly when you're in government against a pretty weak opposition, which the Labour Party has been up until the last couple of years. But the simple reality is the only way back for the Conservatives is if Labour, if the blame for the country's current ills and ailments is attached to the Labour Party and attached to this Labour government. And once that blame is decisively attached to the Labour government, for the Conservatives to then present themselves as the alternative government. And, listen, Reform are going to try and do that as well. But the Conservatives do have the hope that no matter how impressive Reform may be, how good their work may be, they're not going to win the next election. Maybe they win 100 seats, and that would be an incredible performance. But they're not going to win the next election, is my view. They may make huge gains, but the only party other than Labour that are going to win the next election could be the Conservatives. So you have to attach the blame to the Labour Party, to this Labour government, for the country's problems. And then once that has been done decisively, and we're not there yet, we're a couple of years from that point probably, before the public decisively define this Labour government as being to blame, she has to bide her time.
It's really interesting to hear you say that about Reform not winning the next general election, but being able to gain a lot more seats, maybe, 70 to 100, basically because our voting system doesn't work in their favour. But there is a really interesting narrative that is being developed quite effectively, admittedly on social media only, which is not necessarily representative of normal people. But you'll have Rupert Lowe, as you rightly pointed out. Elliot was on our podcast a few weeks ago saying we're going to win the next election. And this is building and building and building and building. And it's a narrative that's actually gathering a head of steam, I think. Darwin, do you think at the moment reforms, if you like, their PR activities literally blowing everyone else out of the water?
Well, I certainly think in terms of their main opposition, in terms of the Conservatives, it's having an impact because I think it's getting a bit under their skin now. They are getting clearly a bit heated by all of this PR stuff that is going on by reform, especially the stuff on Twitter. And I think from what Elliot was saying earlier, I think the way we need to think about what the Conservative strategy and Kemi's strategy probably is right now is what we were talking about in terms of what Labour might be thinking, which is short-term pain for long-term gain. And so I don't think Kemi's necessarily going to be looking at this by-election that's coming up and going, this is where I need to plant my flag and this is what I'm going to be judged by. That's just going to be an initial test to see what cut through she's had. But I think for reform, it's a far bigger test to see what momentum they still have following the general election. And I don't know if either of you know the breakdown kind of how that seat went at the general election, who the second party was. But if it was reform, I think the real gauntlet is then thrown down to go and win it. Or if it was the Conservatives, again, to go and win it. But I think the pressure right now is probably more on reform just because they've had a leader that's been a little bit more stable than the Conservatives has. She's only been in for, a couple of months now. And so she's still kind of really getting set in. And then I think tests in the next year or two are more her target.
I think there's also, just a final point on reform, something that's really interesting from a human nature perspective. Bearing in mind I'm the oldest person in this room, right? If reform won't win, I don't think, the next general election. I think I agree with you, Elliot, though, I might change my view in a few months' time. If they don't, the following general election, Nigel Farage is going to be knocking 70. Rupert Lowe is going to be, with the greatest of respect, an older man. It leaves the party in quite an interesting position in terms of where the talent is. In terms of, I know a little about Nigel Farage for all kinds of reasons. I can't imagine that he would want to be campaigning into his 70s when he could be out, in the channel, not necessarily spotting dinghies, but fishing. So I think there's a really interesting dynamic at play, which is you've got people like Farage or Lowe who are making the headlines, getting a lot of support. But actually, if it's going to take 10 years for reform to get into government, I don't think I'll be hanging around.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's really that same kind of pipeline of potential leader at the minute because, A, they've got a very small parliamentary group, but also B, it's largely, to some extent, built initially around kind of Nigel Farage and some of the popularity that he built up back even from when he was at UKIP. And so, yeah, they don't have that breadth. And I think the real challenge for them then, which is perhaps why they're pushing so hard in their PR and social media strategy right now, is they need to make as big a effect as possible within the next 5-year period and really show they've had an impact, and that impact is then sustained. And then perhaps that's then the line for them to start beginning to wean in a new set of leaders to take over from then on.
And a quick couple of thoughts on something else I mentioned earlier. May, the local council elections. Obviously, that gets us into devolution. Elliot, the TPA's current position on this?
Yeah, listen, there's a sort of a couple of broad principles which the TPA hold, which is, firstly, the less the bureaucracy, the better. The less bureaucracy, the better. But the other principle is the closer to the public the decision makers are, generally is also better. Problem with devolution is that those two principles seem to be coming into conflict. So devolution has not meant reduced bureaucracy at central government level, with that all being moved down much closer to the public, through through mayors or combined authorities or the rest of it. What seems to have happened so far is we've just created new layers of bureaucracy, new bodies to consult and engage with, new sets of pen pushers to create strategies and planning documents and so on and so forth. What we haven't yet seen is decisive evidence that actually devolution means central government is going to hand huge amounts of powers, responsibility, bureaucracy, spending power to local government and different levels of local government, with a reduction of those powers and responsibilities to central government. We've just seen duplication and added layers of bureaucracy, which is ultimately a problem.
It is the first episode of 2025 of A Nation of Taxpayers, and you can always drop us an email and say hello and say Happy New Year. The email address is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com, podcast@taxpayersalliance.com. I mentioned this earlier. We're going to hear about some of the success stories that have been featured in the media over the last several days, courtesy of the Taxpayers Alliance, who've been dominating the headlines. Let's welcome into our podcast studio, Joanna Marchong. Hello.
Hello, Duncan.
And welcome to the podcast. First time that you've been on this podcast.
Yep, thank you for having
which
me.
is great. Now, I was sitting on the sofa at home, scrolling on my smartphone, as many of us do, in between that period between Christmas and New Year, and there was a beaming picture of you with the Daily Telegraph.
Yes.
So you've been working on a story all to do with mental health days and the increasing number of mental health days the public sector staff are taking off, right?
Yes, exactly.
So tell our listener a bit more about it.
Right. So it was a really rewarding kind of end of the year, putting together the sheet where we've FOI'd all councils in the UK. And essentially, the data is super interesting because we've heard loads of stories about sickness leave and absences and number of sick days lost. But what we've showed here is that sickness days lost in councils has actually kind of remained the same. It's increased marginally, but it stayed around the 7.5 kind of million days lost region. But what has increased quite substantially by like about, I think the increase is around 6,000 people in the last 2 years using this as an excuse, is mental health. And that's depression, anxiety, kind of not manic episodes, but things along that strain. And the data's just showed that it's become a rising excuse for people working in councils to use to get days off.
Now, I have a little bit of insight here because before returning to the world of media, I worked in the public sector and I was associated to a local authority. And I did find it fascinating with how easy it is for some people to give the impression that mentally they're not too happy with the world, so therefore that's a reason not to go to work. And that kind of behavior simply would not be tolerated in the private sector.
Yeah, exactly. And it's we've talked about sickness in local government before. We had a blog on the TPA by David Taylor, which is the councillor for St Edward's Havering. And he actually shone a really good light on it in a way that I didn't think about it before, because obviously I'm working in a private sector job. I don't really have an insight into what their lives look like. But he was saying about how there's a link between bankrupt councils and the financial pressures that they're under, and then their staff taking days off, which is better than sitting here kind of talking about how, they just want a day off, they want to go on holiday, so they're taking these days. But if that's the case and that correlation is correct, then we should be increasingly worried, because what I haven't done is I haven't tried the maths on what these days adds up to, but he did in his blog, and it was in the millions for councils if you look at it in a kind of monetary way. But councils, I mean, we've heard this all of last year. It's kind of they're on the verge of bankruptcy or they are bankrupt. And if it's the case, we should be very worried coming into this year.
Elliot, this is a great bit of research.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a much broader problem in the public sector, the amount of sick leave that's taken. I think it's about 50% higher the number of sick days taken for all causes in the public sector versus private sector. This despite the fact that they receive more generous annual leave than the private sector. They normally have access to more flexible working arrangements and they work fewer hours. So the question is, why are you taking so much more sick leave than your private sector counterparts? You're working less, more annual leave, all the rest of it. And in particular, why are these jobs that, as mentioned, fewer hours, more annual leave, why are they causing you such strain on your mental health? And that leads you to wonder to what extent a lot of this is exaggerated by people that know that they can play the system.
And I'm just sitting here listening to you talk, and you too, Joanna, thinking that there's not going to be a fix to this, particularly when you consider Angela Rayner's employment rights bill that's coming down the tracks, which I'm sure anyone in the public sector will be fully embracing. Did you discover anything else as part of your freedom of information request? I mean, a leading question for me would be, how easy is it to get this kind of data? Are councils and organisations quite forthcoming?
Well, so the process of doing an FOI, Freedom of Information request, is kind of a bit tenuous. I think the response rate on this one I did was actually pretty good, even though I had some councils that I had to go back and forth with, which you get at a kind of general level each time you do these kinds of investigations. But they were kind of forthcoming. They kept on sending me to annual accounts maybe, or they gave me the average each worker would have taken in the year, which you would think council levels of staff, like how many staff they employ, would just be an annual accounts or something easy to find. But that's another thing I'm working on, where they don't really disclose that information either. So not only are more people taking sick days, and that's costing us, but also the number of people in councils, from just the small bit that I've been able to go through of my own data so far, is also going up as well. So there is a major problem in terms of like information, how we get it, how long it takes to get it. And I think that's a just general problem to anyone doing, like, trying to find out anything.
Joanna, thank you. That's really interesting. Darwin, data is so important. I mean, Joanna there was talking about freedom of information requests. You've been doing some work over the last few weeks and again made some newspaper headlines looking at the effects of air passenger duty. How did you come across that bit of data?
Yeah, I mean, that was a great piece of research by Joanna, and she did that, as you say, by freedom of information request, which is what we often do. But actually, in this air passenger duty research, what we did instead is we analysed the budget documents that the governments release after the chancellors announced their budget. And as you say, we got an excellent bit of coverage from that, with a front page on the Daily Mail over the festive period. And the reason for that is because it's showing that from now to April 2026, air passenger duty, say for a family of 4 flying to the United States, quite often Florida, shall we say, for a nice family holiday, is going to rise from £352 if they booked it in January of this year to £408 in April 2026, because of what the last Conservative government first brought in, and following Rachel Reeves' latest budget as well.
This is a tax on working people.
Yeah.
Who just want to go to Florida with their kids and go and see Mickey Mouse.
I think it's one of the stealthiest of the stealth taxes as well. It's probably one that, because of the success of the airline industry at keeping costs down, improving efficiency, because of the amount of competition in the airline industry, particularly through the introduction of budget airlines, we don't quite realise how much this has been increased. I mean, it is remarkable. The bit of the research that was most interesting for me was comparing the increase in air passenger duty to inflation. So since it was introduced 30 years ago, it's only introduced 30 years ago, it's not long, inflation has gone up by about 100% roughly, whereas air passenger duty for band A destinations, basically European destinations, has gone up something like 160%, whereas for band B destinations, places like the United States, it's gone up over 700%, and for band C destinations, think of Australia, 800% or over 800%.
Yep.
These are absolutely massive increases, and it basically means that increasingly massive amounts of the price of your plane ticket is simply going straight to the Treasury, and we're not as aware of this as we maybe should be, because the airline industry has done a very impressive job broadly at keeping fares low. And so that means that successive chancellors, Rachel Reeves, now the current one, have been able to hide behind the success of that industry and secretly use it to squeeze taxpayers out of a little bit more cash.
And we shouldn't forget that this is an industry that's still recovering off the back of the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And the British public are still, there's still, I think, a little bit of a hangover. People desperate to go on foreign holidays because of years of not being able to. And of course, this Saturday, which will be the 4th, is the day in which we expect the highest number of holiday bookings for the year. It's called Sunshine Saturday. And for those listening to this podcast that are thinking of booking a holiday, I would take a look at our research and see how much of your plane ticket is actually going to be going to the taxman.
So far we've had 2 great headlines. We talked to Joanna about the amount of mental health days that have been taken off in the public sector. We've also just talked about air passenger duty. Elliot, one of my favourite stories, and yet another good headline. What I like about what the TPA is discovering with this is you can actually create an image in your own head of a hard-pressed local authority worker, someone who might work for a council somewhere, who's literally sitting on a sun lounger, basking in temperatures around 28 Celsius, maybe with a pina colada to hand. I'm mixing it up a little bit on purpose, but with their laptop, doing their work and enjoying the mindset, which is it's all right because the work is being done. But of course, the rest of us have to live in the real world. Just tell us about this story.
Yeah, and it turns out that that picture that you're painting is actually very much a real one. We first uncovered this practice last year. The fact that a significant number of council workers were being allowed to log on remotely from countries outside the United Kingdom. Generally, they have to get permission from their local authority, and they have to tell the local authority which country they're working from. And this is a practice that didn't really exist before the pandemic. In the first year post the pandemic, it was only given out to a relatively small number of people, only 73 people, I think, in the first year. But now that's up to about 730. And, that's not based on every single council in UK as well, only around 2/3 provided data. So this is something that is now growing. It's growing or has grown exponentially over a couple of years. And, it means you have absurd situations like a council worker in West Devon working from Ibiza for 4 years.
When you publish these stories or you give these stories to the media, do the council ever try and justify their decision making?
Yeah, extraordinarily, Central Bedfordshire, which was the worst offender in our latest data set, said that they need to offer this in order to remain competitive in a competitive environment, which is obviously a preposterous thing to say. I think they say they allow their staff 3 weeks a year to be spent abroad. That's on top of their annual leave, of course. And I have to say, I have not heard of this practice really being routine in the private sector, so I don't know what competitive environment they're talking about, unless they're talking about competing with other local authorities who are also allowed in this practice, which is probably what they're talking about.
I think you're right. And on that note, I think we'll draw this episode to a close. Darwin, thank you. Well, great having you on this podcast. We'll have you back again soon. Elliot, always a pleasure. And thank you very much for listening. As always, you can get in contact if there's a particular guest you would like to hear on the future episode, or you have some thoughts about any of the things that we've been discussing on this particular episode. We have an email address and you can get in contact. It is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com. podcast@taxpayersalliance.com. Thank you for listening.